A French priest was sacrificed at an altar today, so let's talk about sacrifice. In the ancient land of Canaan, followers of the god Moloch believed that a man's supreme act of devotion was sacrificing his child to his god. The priests would heat up a bronze statue of Moloch until it was glowing, and the devout would place their children in its fiery arms, where they would burn to death. Then came Abraham. One of the most famous stories in the Old Testament is the story of Yahweh commanding Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. Abraham tied up his son and put him on a pile of wood and was ready to kill him. Critics of the Bible point to this and say, how barbaric that God would tell Abraham to do that and that Abraham would be willing to sacrifice his son. But I think they're missing the point. Abraham was surrounded by people who were convinced that the greatest thing they could do was sacrifice their children to their God. Abraham was ready to do it, but Yahweh told him to stop. The takeaway message of the story of Abraham and Isaac for the surrounding culture was this: Abraham is just as devout as any of you. He's the sort of person who's willing to do whatever his God commands. The difference between you and Abraham is that Abraham's God doesn't want him to sacrifice his son. Abraham's God stops him from sacrificing his son. Abraham's God provides his own sacrifice. The leaders of France are very similar to the priests of Moloch, and the people of France are very similar to the inhabitants of Canaan. I know what you're thinking, French viewers. What do you mean? We're completely secular. No. You have your gods, and you show your devotion to them by sacrificing your own people on the altar of your gods. Earlier today, two jihadis stormed a church in Saint-Étienne-du-Rouvray with knives and a fake bomb. They forced a Catholic priest to his knees and filmed themselves slashing his throat at the altar. They shouted Allahu Akbar while police shot them to death. Interestingly, one of the jihadis had been caught twice last year trying to head to Syria to join ISIS. French agents responded to his repeated attempts to join ISIS by making him wear an electronic bracelet in case he decided to flee the country again. The church was on an ISIS hit list found in the apartment of a foiled jihadi in 2015. So the church was a known target, there were known ISIS supporters in the area, and ISIS recently ordered supporters to attack European targets. But everyone is shocked somehow when a man who had declared his allegiance to ISIS obeys the call to jihad and attacks a church that French authorities knew was a target while France is on high alert because jihadis have been attacking regularly. If that's the target, and that's the terrorist group that the terrorist has sworn allegiance to, and the terrorist group orders the terrorist to attack the target, I'd be more surprised if someone didn't get killed. French authorities knew about all three, and they're shocked, I say, that someone's dead. These guys make Inspector Clouseau look like Batman. How can they be this incompetent? Well, research shows that French authorities are part of a cult that has brainwashed them and keeps them from thinking clearly. It's the cult of tolerance. Tolerance with a lowercase t is a good thing. We disagree, but let's not kill each other over it. That's a healthy kind of tolerance. But there's something else that's called tolerance, but isn't like the other tolerance at all. This kind of tolerance says you have to do what we do and say what we say and think what we think, or we'll destroy you because we're tolerant. Seems like the exact opposite of what the word tolerance actually means, but that's what cults do. They use the same words, but radically change the meanings. This sinister kind of tolerance is much more important to the French. So important, in fact, that we'll call it tolerance with a capital T. We capitalize this kind of tolerance because it's a proper name. The people of France worship it. How do I know they worship it? I know because they sacrifice their people to it. Tolerance, with a capital T, demands sacrifice, and it tests the faith of its followers. For instance, it says, here's a book that calls for your violent subjugation and the destruction of everything you hold dear. I want you to defend it with your lives. I want you to mock and ridicule anyone who dares question or criticize it. And when it comes for your men and your women and your children and your priests, you must offer them all up on my altar to satisfy me. And so the new priests are sacrificing the old. The most brilliant aspect of this cult is its twisting of language. Using the word tolerance to promote and defend the most vicious sort of intolerance is the height of manipulation. Even now, as I'm mocking tolerance with a capital T, you think I'm mocking tolerance with a lowercase t, as if I'm telling you to go out and attack Muslims. The cult of tolerance has brainwashed you into thinking that there are only two possibilities. Either you protect Islam from any criticism whatsoever, or you go on an anti-Muslim killing spree. You don't want to go on an anti-Muslim killing spree, do you? Well then, you have to protect Islam from any criticism whatsoever. Absolutely ridiculous to think that these are the only alternatives, but cults have their myths. And this is the most cherished myth of the cult of tolerance. Those of us who reject the cult know that if you want to protect your men and your women and your children and your priests, you don't have to go on any killing sprees. You just have to stop protecting Islam from criticism. Islam can't stand up to criticism. That's why jihadis kill cartoonists, as the people of France know all too well. This is shockingly simple. Learn the facts about Muhammad and the Quran and share them until they become common knowledge. In the meantime, the French military will have to deal with military threats, and French police will have to deal with local threats. But the only long-term solution to jihad is to undermine and expose its root, which is Muhammad. And this isn't just good for the victims of terrorism, it's good for potential terrorists as well. I don't know about you, but when I read about a 19-year-old who had already tried repeatedly to join ISIS, slitting a priest's throat, and I know that he did it because his community pumped his head full of complete nonsense, and no one bothered to challenge what was being pumped into his head because the cult of false tolerance says, keep your mouth shut and let him die and take as many people with him as possible. I think to myself, what kind of monster would I be if I didn't shout this from the rooftops? Letting these young men kill and die for the most obvious false prophet in history is beyond heartless. But what else should we expect from a nation that sacrifices its own children and its own priests on the altar of false tolerance? Tear down the altar, France. False tolerance is no more worthy of worship than Moloch.